Okay, we having some battery issues. All right. Okay. All right. Right. Okay. All right. Until we reckon. Violence, mass incarceration, a road to repair. Okay. Let's get this back here. Once again, please share this post. Anybody? I'm going to share it myself. Give me 1 second. 1 second, y'all. Alright. Ah, shoot. My finger. Dang. Alright. Please share this post. We are on the ongoing teaching to say their name square. Day 7. We are reading Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered. April 7th, day 7, book 7. For anybody, this is the book we are reading, Until We Reckon. I know I'm a little, let me scoot over so I get more in the center. I'm offset. I know this is going to look a little uneven, but it'll do. Okay. Until We Reckon. Gonna pick up where we left off at. Step 5. Step 5. No longer committing similar harm. It is not easy to become someone who will not commit harm again. Most of us are not yet those people. Oh, hold on, let me get this coffee open. I gotta go get a coffee run, man. I'm cut my finger, man. Dang. All right. Excuse me. I'm sorry. My fault, man. My fault. All right, let's pick up where we left off. Step 5. No longer committing similar harm. It is not easy to become someone who will not commit harm again. Most of us are not yet those people. But accountability requires that becoming. This is particularly challenging when we understand that violence is driven by structural and contextual factors that are not changed by an accountability process. Still, it is the work of accountability to transform as much as possible within those constraints so as not to cause more pain to others. This requires, in part, that responsible parties develop a greater sense of self-worth and dignity, develop empowered relationships to the obstacles in their lives, believe they can lead long lives and be determined to live, set short and long-term goals, and create new avenues toward acquiring authentic and life-affirming power. It requires that they demonstrate respect for those they encounter, become conscious about their respective histories on individual and structural levels, begin to understand their emotional, psychological, physical, and social responses to their experiences past and present, identify what they are responsible for in their everyday lives and to whom, and ask for help when needed and collaborate with those in their support system to meet those needs. No longer committing violence requires that responsible parties understand the roles of violence in their lives, foster reciprocal relationships by sharing knowledge and experiences, communicate effectively, including expressing what they need to say, develop or strengthen empathy for others, develop self-awareness about and strategies to handle anger effectively, acknowledge the impact their actions have on their own lives and those around them, build durable strategies to cope with stressors, and, for many, develop a healthier sense of masculinity and manhood. That's true. No longer committing violence also... Hold on, let me get a drink here. Okay, so this has been very... Okay. No longer committing violence also requires developing coping strategies to deal with factors that underlie much violence, such as economic and housing instability. People with nowhere to live or not enough to eat will always have a harder time refraining from causing harm than will people with the benefit of that stability. Those factors are never solely within a responsible party's control, so they demand the fulfillment not only of the person's promises, but of our larger societal responsibility to create the conditions that make violence less likely. And no longer committing harm requires healing, not as a replacement for responsibility, but as a dimension of it. Research unequivocally shows that one of the most surefire predictors of violence is surviving it. Nearly everyone who has committed harm has survived it, and few have received any formal support to heal. None of the violence people have experienced excuses what they go on to do, but it is unquestionably a factor in why they caused harm. I believe when we hurt someone, we incur an obligation. Period. Nothing changes that obligation, not our own history of pain, our unhealed trauma, nothing. That is true because the obligation we incur arises out of our humanity, our agency, and our dignity, and each of those things are fully present in everyone who commits harm. So what happens when we come to understand that part of why we cause harm is because of our own unhealed... So what happens when we come to understand that part of why we cause harm is because of our own unhealed pain? Our insight does not erase that first obligation. Instead, we incur a second obligation to heal through that pain so we no longer pass it along to others. And then the larger we, as a society, have an obligation to meet people in that process and provide them with the resources and the support they need to come through their pain. That means that our history of surviving violence does not get us off the hook, but it does beg the question of where societal supports when we were hurt. Okay, that means that our history of surviving violence does not get us off the hook, but it does beg the question of where societal supports were when we were hurt, and thus puts the larger society on the hook as well. Our healing also supports our ability to be accountable by strengthening our capacity for empathy. Accountability requires that people who commit harm consider how the people they harm felt during and after the crime. Fairly often, responsible parties will say some version of, they felt fine. They will express that they believe the people they harmed were likely unaffected by the violence and that it did not matter much. For some people who hear this, the response sends off the sociopathy alarms. They read into it an elemental incapacity for empathy. They see the person's minimization of the impact of the harm caused as an indicator of the disconnection from others' feelings and suffering. They see in that pathological inhumanity one many people believe may be innate, or if not innate, at least irreparable. That conclusion fundamentally misunderstands how empathy works in context. The basic emotional gesture of empathy works something like this. We listen to someone else's experience, mine our own experience for the closest corollary we can find, remember how we felt at that time, and extrapolate from that information to reach some understanding about how the other person must feel. Okay, 1 second. All right. Again, we are reading Until We Reckon. We are on page 121. It's just one of the things I do. I like to highlight things when I read. So I'm just going through. That effort of reflection that effort of reflection and extrapolation is empathy. I'm gonna read that again. Hold on, my fault, man. Is she in her bag? Okay. That conclusion fundamentally misunderstands how empathy works in context. The basic emotional gesture of empathy works something like this. We listen to someone else's experience, mine our own experience for the closest corollary we can find, remember how we felt at that time, and extrapolate from that information to reach some understanding about how the other person must feel. That effort of reflection and extrapolation is empathy. It seems quite simple. You get punched. I think about the time I got punched. I ask myself, how did I feel? I answer, I felt afraid, angry, and later sad. I assume you probably feel afraid and angry and sad. The problem for people who have committed harm isn't that they are not engaging in empathy. The problem is what they find when they mind their experience, because what happens if what they find there is nothing? It is not only true that many people who commit violence are survivors of it. It is also true that many of those survivors belong to groups of people whose pain our society devalues, whether they are young men whom our society tells that they should be tough and impervious to pain, young women and gender nonconforming people whom our society tells that they provoke the harm done to them, or people of color whom our society tells that their pain is neither as substantial nor as important as white people's pain. And while we're here in this moment, we talk about cross-referencing things. This is a moment when we can cross-reference the concepts that we've talked about when we speak about intersectionality. So there is an intersection between this group, intersection between, say, the young men, and then people of color. So young men of color face this double. They face society telling them that they're supposed to be tough and impervious to pain, and they also face society telling them that their pain that they do feel is neither substantial nor as important as white people's pain. And then the same thing when it speaks about young women and gender nonconforming people. There are young women and gender nonconforming people who society tells that they provoke the harm done to them. And then there are also people of colors that society tells that their pain is not substantial as of white people. So there's people who have that double, who have that in twofold. Okay, So what happens to empathy in this context? If I draw on my own most comparable experience and think back to how I felt, what if I had told myself and my culture told me that I felt fine, that it was normal, no big deal, to be expected? What if someone later asked me, how do you think he felt when you put your gun to his head? What if I did what empathy requires and asked myself, when a gun was placed in my head, how did I feel? And what if the only answer left to me after the minimization of my pain had been, fine? That is, what I would have assumed that the person I hurt had also felt. It is not that people whose pain has been devalued are not enacting empathy. It is that when they mind their own experience, they often find our culture's answer about their pain and tell it back to us. They tell us it doesn't exist and that even if it does, it doesn't matter. Oh, she in a bag. She is getting in a bag. Okay, I see what she on. She doing some. This may be the first person really going into some real deep psychoanalyzing of some of these situations. I really enjoy the way our I really enjoy the simplicity in which she's writing in. A lot of the things that we have read has been of more of a dense nature, more of having to sort of amendments and constitutions and laws, and remembering a lot of names of politicians, and remembering a lot of dates of events, and so that can be taxing mentally. This is very taxing emotionally, though. Some of the stories that I've read, and they, just the amount of emotional the amount of empathy, this is like one of the things that I early on realized was something that was needed to be spoken more of, and we needed more conversation around, is the concept of empathy. And I feel like that was one of our biggest impediments is empathy, not as lacking empathy. And to see the way that she's talking about empathy and breaking down empathy and breaking down, breaking down her philosophy of what empathy is and how that can be used to get us out of this penal system is very profound. And it's very true what she's talking about certain cultures where your pain, it is a thing in not just inwardly in black communities, but outwardly in black communities to be tough. Not to be tough, for your pain to not matter, and for you to feel like ain't no point in even telling nobody what I'm going through because they're not going to care about what I'm going through anyways. That is a very real thing. And then you compound that with being a black man, where as a man in this society you are told that to toughen up, and that whatever you're feeling is invalidated if you cannot if your pain manifests, or your emotional baggage manifests in a way that is not the societal norm. I remember, for a long time, like feeling as if like I couldn't cry when I was younger. Like I was a boy, I couldn't cry, and it was, this negative connotation towards it. And then getting older and realizing that that has nothing to do with manliness or manhood, whether you cry or not, or how often you cry, or what you cry at, it's just that is a societal norm. And anyways, in order for survivors who have gone on to commit harm to become more consistently capable of practicing empathy in the way so many people, including survivors themselves, seek, we have to begin by validating their pain, terror, and suffering as real, and by validating what happened to them as wrong. We have to say, this thing you said was no big deal. It was a big deal. It mattered. You mattered. It was wrong. It shouldn't have been done to you. When that happens for survivors, they become capable of owning the fact that what happened to them was wrong and acknowledging the full range of emotions they felt at the time. At times, responsible parties will struggle to take accountability for what they have done, and may struggle in particular to acknowledge the impact they had on the victims of their crimes. They reach a limit to the insight they are able to develop. Often the intervention that enables them to break through that limit is an engagement with their own trauma and healing. When our attention turns there, we typically find underestimated, ignored, and unhealed pain. When we create the space to validate that pain and allow it to be spoken about, responsible parties become capable of decisively naming its impact on them as more than nothing. With support, they can speak to their hypervigilance, insomnia, digestive problems, flashbacks, and night terrors. They can tell the truth that they were hurt and that it mattered. Then when it comes to empathy, they can do the same thing they have always been doing, which is to see the corollary between their experience and that of others. Only this time they find something different when they mind their own experience. This time they infer that the person they harmed probably couldn't sleep for days, that their stomach didn't feel quite right for years, that their dreams were horrifying. This time they infer that after what they did, the person they hurt didn't trust their girlfriend. This time they infer that after what they did, the person they hurt didn't trust their girlfriend, didn't trust their family, never felt safe in the street. This time they infer that nothing felt the same or would ever feel the same again. That conclusion becomes a solid basis for accountability, which includes seeing, acknowledging, and answering to someone's pain. Being able to fully regard the depth of that pain is an essential component of being fully accountable. To the degree that Excuse me. To the degree that unacknowledged and unhealed pain is a barrier to that regard, it is an enemy of accountability. We need to commit to healing in its own right, but we also need to commit to healing because of the way in which unhealed pain guts accountability and, in so doing, takes its place among the most pragmatic priorities of a culture that values safety. And accountability takes its place among that culture's moral demands. For harmed parties, the transformation of the people who hurt them into people who will not hurt anyone in that way again can constitute the most meaningful and useful conclusion to an accountability process. That is in part because it ensures their future safety as it relates to the person who harmed them. But it is more than that. It is to the great credit of survivors that they are typically as invested in other people's safety as they are in their own. So any process that protects only them from future harm is incomplete, both morally and as a contributor to their healing. I be wondering how long chapter it is. Of course. Oh, excuse me, y'all. Oh, well, okay. Share this post. I'm finna share this. I need to share this live. We need to share this live. Share this live. We are reading. Hold on 1 second, y'all. We are reading Until We Reckon by Danielle. Share this live. Share this live. I'm finna need to get on here, man. If anybody knows, man, this, okay. Okay. Share this live. I'm finna go share it. Share this live. Okay, so we are reading Until We Reckon. This is the 7th book in our ongoing Teaching and Say Their Name Square. This is the 7th day. This book focuses on dealing with violent offenders outside of the penal system, which we know today, outside of the system of mass incarceration in which we deal with today. I feel like this is uneven. Hold on. Man, it's crazy. It's really be blowing me. Okay, I got this rain jacket on because I was informed it was supposed to rain today. It just ain't manifested. That's good. That's real good. Okay. Okay. Ongoing teaching, day 7, book 7, Until We Reckon. I'm just trying to share the post real quick. Y'all give me 1 second. Oof. Excuse me. Hope me yawning ain't making nobody else yawn. Okay, again, we are reading Until We Reckon, speaking about dealing with violent offenders outside of the penal system that we know of today. Speaking a lot about restorative justice and what restorative justice looks like and the philosophy behind restorative justice. And sounds like this woman worked in a program that was linked to the courts in which she was being, basically people were being assigned to these restorative justice programs. And so I think that when people ask about answers and what does answers look like and things like that, to me, this is what answers look like. Like, this is a book talking about getting to answers. This is a book talking about getting to answers, and so that's what it is that we're trying to do, is get to answers. And when people ask questions about what do answers look like, this is one of those things. Restorative justice is one of those things. And so I think what we got to do is start challenging ourselves to have these conversations. Let's not just go out and hold on. Let me share this. Let me share this post. Share and watch. Share and watch. I'm shooting this out. That just got shot out. Okay, so I got to pin this to the top of the page too. Hey, how you doing? It's going well. It's going. It was supposed to rain. I was Covered up in anticipation, nervous for it. It ain't came yet. Huh? No, yeah, I am. No, yeah, I am. I gotta share the page. It's live. I gotta share the page. I'll share the page. Share the post. I like to, whenever we do it, I like to pin the. We like to pin the live that we're currently doing to the top of the page, so that way when people come, they can see it. So I gotta go pin it to the page. How you doing? You having a good day? That's good. That's good.
The dog is good. She's been out twice so far, so
Really?
came down to read for you.
Really? Okay. I'm almost finished with this chapter. I'll give it to you. Not this chapter. All right, man. Oh, it's not gonna let me get on the internet. Be tripping over here. So crazy. Why? All right, y'all. If you watching it, okay, here we go. Let's see. I just want to pin it to the page. Wow, they really not gonna let me. Okay, it's fine. All right, small things. All right, let's finish this chapter up. Again, we are reading Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. This speaking about restorative justice and what restorative justice looks like and some of the philosophies behind restorative justice. We are finishing up. I'm not sure what number chapter this is. I came in the midst of it. But we've got a few pages left in this chapter. We got about 4 or 5 pages left in this chapter, and then we got somebody else that's going to hop in and read. Okay. So any process that protects only them from future harm is incomplete, both morally and as a contributor to their healing. Only a process that extends the same protection to others truly meets their needs. When that happens, the impact is palpable. When the person who harmed them changes in a positive way, the benefit of that evolution accrues to survivors and their healing. Of course, that benefit accrues to the community as well, as the transformed person becomes a contributor to the social fabric rather than an impediment to it. Communities capable of improvement are places where people can be well. That is because healthy communities are not defined by perfection, which does not exist. They are defined by the potential for change. In embodying that potential, people who repair harm not only mend the particular tear to the social fabric for which they are responsible, but strengthen the fabric as a whole. There is wide agreement that survivors deserve to have the people who harmed them held accountable to them and to other people affected by their actions. This process can help satisfy the moral demands of a culture, facilitate the survivor's healing, and validate that what happened to them is wrong. All of that is true. But we also have to understand that people who commit harm also deserve accountability in the toughest and most generous sense of the word. They deserve to have to pay in a meaningful way for what they have done. They deserve the difficulty of that reckoning and even the fear and pain it may cause. But they also deserve a process that will allow them a way out of the shame and its associated violence. Accountability, as outlined here, is as essential for those who cause harm as it is for those who survive it. That is because when practiced well, it is not just an obligation, but also an avenue to dignity. In our culture, we have many reference points for healing processes. We know that when we survive harm or suffer a loss, there is a process we undertake to come through it. Whether we think about those as stages of grief or phases of healing, we know there are things we have to do and can do to help us recuperate our sense of dignity, of self-worth, of connectedness, and of hope. Many of us are familiar with the stages of grief, widely regarded as some variation of denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Our understanding of those stages not only helps us to navigate each one, but helps us experience even our hardest ones as part of a longer trajectory towards healing. I believe that when we cause harm, we are affected by what we have done. We are damaged by it in ways we rarely talk about. I often ask people interested in accountability work to take a brief exercise which goes like this. Think about a time you did something wrong and then repaired that harm as much as possible. Pay attention to how you feel when you remember that. Pay attention to where you feel it in your body, how it feels in your mind and heart. Now remember a time when you did something wrong and you did not repair it. Because it was too late, because you did not know how, because by the time you were ready, the person you hurt was gone, and pay attention to how that feels in your body, your mind, your heart. Having done this exercise with hundreds of people, I have not encountered a single person who has said that the two memories felt the same. The first, the one we repaired, is typically something we can think of with relative comfort. We can hold the feeling and still feel like ourselves, can still feel deserving of love, can feel proud of the way we are in the world, can feel connected to those around us in a positive way. The latter, though the feeling of harm we have caused and not repaired sits differently, the best word I know for it is shame. It is not a perfect word, but it is the closest I have. It is not a perfect word, but it is the closest I have found. That second feeling, for most of us, is much harder to hold. It rubs up against our dignity, our self-love, our pride, our connectedness. For many of us, it feels much closer to the parts of ourselves where we hold the things that have done to us and have not been repaired. It is a hard feeling, an uneasy one, even a painful one. It is what it feels like to be human beings who have done wrong. This is especially problematic in light of Dr. Gilligan's work that concludes that the greatest driver of violence is shame. As he sees it, the relationship between violence and shame is in part about eradicating witnesses to our failings, our incompleteness, our flaws, and our weakness. Whether in our homes or in the streets, violence as a vehicle to overcome shame is about damaging or destroying those who have seen us as limited, afraid, or incapable. It is about insisting on our power by inflicting pain so as not to be seen in our vulnerability or powerlessness. If Gilligan is right, and if committing violence causes us to feel shame, then committing violence becomes a risk factor for committing more violence. We hurt people, we are ashamed. We hurt people, we are ashamed of it. We act that shame out as violence and repeat. As human beings, we find shame intolerable and we are moved to act to escape it. Absent a healthy avenue of that shame, one of the core tactics we turn to is violence. I have long been persuaded that the only avenue out of shame is accountability. It is answering for what we have done and making things as right as we can that transforms shame. So often our instinct is to hide or deny the things for which we are accountable. There may be a feeling of safety in that avoidance, but it is detrimental, not only to the harmed party and the members of the community who suffer from our dishonesty, but to ourselves when we are the ones responsible for harm. Shame thrives on secrecy. Shame thrives on secrecy. It grows in the dark. It is the only bright light of the day that can evaporate it. It is only the bright light of the day that can evaporate it. In telling the truth, responsible parties give up the comfort of denial, which insulate them from knowing the full impact of their choices. They also give up the relative security of privacy, which insulates them from the feeling of exposure and vulnerability. But they gain something in return, a pathway out of the shadows in which shame thrives. In expressing remorse, responsible parties acknowledge the harmful impact of their power and the damage done not only to others, but to themselves, in exercising that power wrongfully. In owning the impact of their actions, they own the power, and with the distress of what they have done, that distress is evidence of... Oh man, I messed that one up. 1 second, y'all. Remember, if you watching this, share this. Please share this, man. We need y'all sharing this. We need y'all sharing this. My phone, man, the internet. We having some internet difficulties today, man. The laptop tripping, the Wi-Fi tripping, the phone tripping, batteries is dying. It's supposed to rain. I got on this raincoat. It's been crazy today. This has really been a crazy book. Excuse me, y'all. Sorry. I was up late last night reading. This has been a very, I shouldn't use the word crazy. I don't like to simplify something because I don't feel it. It's not good to simplify a thought or a feeling because you don't want to take the time to reach for the word. So let me take the time to reach for the word. It has been enlightening. Yes, that's what enlightening and insightful. That's the first two words that. Man, this thing keep on doing this. Enlightening and insightful are the first two words that come to mind when I think about this book right now. We coming up on the last page before we get to the end of this chapter. So let me knock this out and then okay. This is the last page now. Again, this chapter is called "In Praise of Accountability." until we reckon about dealing with violent offenders outside of the penal system we know now. Uh, I have long been persuaded that the only avenue out of shame is accountability. It is answering for what we have done and making things as right as we can that transforms shame. So often our instinct is to hide or deny things for which things we are accountable. There may be a feeling of safety in that avoidance, but it is detrimental, not only to the harmed party and the members of the community who suffer from our dishonesty, but to ourselves when we are the ones responsible for harm. Shame thrives on secrecy. It grows in the dark. It is only the bright light of day that can evaporate it. In telling the truth, responsible parties give up the comfort of denial, which insulates them from knowing the full impact of their choices. They also give up the relative security of privacy, which insulate them from the feeling of exposure and vulnerability. But they gain something in return, a pathway out of the shadows in which shame thrives. In expressing remorse, responsible parties acknowledge the harmful impact of their power and the damage done not only to others, but to themselves in exercising that power wrongfully. In owning the impact of their actions, they own their power and the fact of their connectedness to others. However painful it is to sit with the distress of what they have done, that distress is evidence of their humanity, their empathy, and the persistence of their relationships with others, even in the aftermath of harm. These qualities, humanity, empathy, and relatedness, are the sweet enemies of shame because they reveal shame's impermanence by lighting the pathway out. Then, in repairing harm by doing sorry and engaging in the labor of transformation, responsible parties reclaim their deservedness of respect. If shame is in part about eradicating witnesses, the best counter to it is to become someone who can be proud to be seen. By exercising the power responsible parties use to harm in the service of repair instead, they become legitimately and positively reconnected to their own power. By healing through their own histories of trauma, they become people anchored in resilience and change. In integrating their past into their present and future, they become people whose imperfections are human and whose failings are repairable. They become people who no longer seek secrecy or find comfort in it. Rather, they seek to be witnessed because what they are doing is worthy and they know it in their bones. In this way, accountability does for those of us who committed harm what the healing process does for us when we are harmed. It gives us a way to recuperate our sense of dignity, our self-worth, our connectedness, and our hope, the things we lost when we caused harm. It is like grieving too, in that it begins with an emotion that feels impossible to bear and ends in a place of resolution and integration. I am therefore persuaded that accountability is the corollary to grief for when we cause harm, and it is as essential as the grieving process is in restoring us to our best selves. We would do well to develop our methodologies for supporting people through accountability as thoroughly as we have developed our methodologies for supporting people through grief. It is no less necessary for a healthy society and no less possible. If accountability is the avenue to dignity, that means that in replacing accountability with punishment, we have denied those responsible for harm precisely the process that would allow them to recuperate their dignity, transform their lives, and halt the cycles of violence they are otherwise at enormous risk of perpetuating. This is not unlike or unrelated to the way we deny survivors what they need most, by allowing punishment, which offers them almost nothing, to take the place of accountability which they so richly and fully deserve. We also pay the price for the loss on a larger scale. We become a culture mostly incapable of repair, so that every rip in the social fabric compounds the last so that every rip in the social fabric compounds the last until we can barely see ourselves as part of a whole. But we are capable of inverting this reality and of making accountability and the justice it promises the norm for our nation. We can do so not just by ending incarceration, but by displacing it. Okay, so I think I want to see how much of that chapter I came in on. Then we're gonna pass this off. So I came in this set. I missed the first two things. Okay, so the first chapter was Prison's Broken Promise. The first chapter is Across the River of Fire. Some long chapters. Second chapter was Prison's Broken Promise. And then I just read the third chapter, which is In Praise of Accountability. And we'll go through and talk about more of these things later, but we're going to have another person come up and read. Again, this is Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered. And this is speaking about dealing with violent offenders outside of the mass incarceration system. And I love this sentence that she ended this chapter on. Again, one of the things we have been saying is knowing when certain books we are trying to get information and knowledge as far as education and stats and stories out of and experiences out of or something like that, and then knowing who we are reading to get philosophy from. And this is philosophy that she's giving us. She says right here, we cannot do, she says right here, but we are capable of averting this reality and of making accountability and the justice it promises the norm for our nation. We can do so not just by ending incarceration, but by displacing it. I like that, displacing it, destroying one system and then creating another one. Okay, so the next chapter is about displacing incarceration, chapter 4. I'm gonna grab my shoes. So you read it before then? You had already read it? No? Yeah, okay.
I was listening.
You were listening? Okay, yeah.
I was listening when Jeff was reading. I was like, yep. Okay, my mom needs this.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, it's all yours.
Awesome. Starting on 4?
Yep, chapter 4.
Awesome.
I want to be on the edge of my seat. And then headphones here.
What do I need the headphones for?
Just so that way you can hear yourself.
Oh.
If you don't want to hear yourself, you can take it off too. But for me, it comforts me so that way I don't have to. I can hear myself talking. I don't hear outside.
How do I make it smaller?
They do it I know everybody has to I'm sorry.
I think it's all right.
If you talk, can you hear yourself?
I can hear myself.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Okay.
That's all you.
So I'm reading Until We Reckon, and this is chapter 4, Displacing Incarceration. Elijah was riding the bus home one day when someone across from him asked where he was from. He was nervous. He knew that a young man from another housing project had been killed that week where he lived and expected someone was planning to retaliate. But he was proud and he had nothing to do with the killing, so he answered, Libiona. When the bus pulled into the next stop, a group of about a dozen young men rushed into it through the front and back doors. The young man Elijah had spoken to nodded, and the group surrounded him, beating him to the ground. Then they jumped off the bus and ran. The bus driver kept driving, and Elijah got off a few stops later at his house. He walked to his apartment and through the front door and collapsed. His brother Danielle was home and saw Elijah fall to the ground. His face was already swelling and his shirt was stained with his blood. Danielle considered calling an ambulance, but when his brother regained consciousness and did not appear to have any life-threatening injuries, he did not consider calling the police. He had plenty of encounters with the police. It was the height of the stop and frisk era in New York City, and he was a black man in America, as had his friends and family, and before that, his parents and ancestors, and few, if any, of those stories ended with people being safer. That said, he knew that if no one was made to answer for the harm done to his brother, Elijah would only be in more danger for not defending himself, not retaliating, not being a man. Danielle, who had a bit of name for himself in the streets, was deeply protective of his brother, who was, even in his own words, a nerd. He was afraid for Elijah's safety, so Danielle helped his brother off the floor and walked towards the door. "Come with me," he said, and Elijah did. As they left their building, several of their friends joined them for a walk. They saw Elijah's face and knew they were going. The brothers and their friends approached the bus stop and saw Elwyn standing there. Elwyn was on the phone with his girlfriend, who was on her way home from work on the approaching bus about 2 blocks away. He turned and saw a group of 5 young men walking toward him. Danielle and Elijah stopped, the other 3 young men standing behind them. Danielle turned to his brother and asked, "Was he with them?" Elijah mistakenly thought he recognized Elwyn's face from the mob, could picture it from where he looked up from the floor of the bus, and answered yes. Elwyn didn't know what they were talking about, but right as Elijah said yes, he saw one of the other young men flash a gun. Elwyn had buried 2 of his friends in the past 2 months. He was consumed with grief, but the main feeling he had wasn't sorrow, but fear. He had come to think that death by violence was imminent, maybe even inevitable. But he was not ready to die. He looked at this group and outnumbered him 5 to 1, looked at the gun and it promised death, reached in his pocket for the knife he carried, swung the knife at the person closest to him, and ran. Elijah did not feel the cut at first. He saw his shirt turn red. When he touched his hand to his cheek, it met his teeth. He was cut from his jaw to the corner of his mouth. He felt in shock. He joined the others as they took off running after Elwyn. They chased Elwyn into a store. They fought there, and Elwyn eventually locked himself in the store bathroom. When he thought one of the young men was finally going to succeed in breaking through the door, he pushed himself out, swinging and heading for the door. In the scuffle, someone got a hold of his knife. He ran outside where his sister and the police were arriving at the same time. Danielle, Elijah, and Elwyn were all arrested. Elijah would get a bandage for his face, but no stitches or real care until he made bail days later, after the wound had clumsily closed. The scar in his face is as much a testament to the lack of treatment as to the cut itself. Danielle would spend much longer on Rikers Island. His family could afford to bail only one of them out, and he insisted that they release Elijah first, where he would spend some time in the infirmary as a result of an acute health issue. The paramedic checked out Elwyn. The paramedic checked out Elwyn cursorily before putting him in handcuffs. She said he was fine. His sister looked at her brother and knew something was wrong and insisted that the paramedic check again. On second review, the paramedic found a small wound in his back where the knife had entered and broken off in his lung, puncturing it. Still handcuffed, Elwyn was put in the ambulance rather than the police car, where he was made to ride the whole way on his back, the blade digging further in. He would have one surgery in the city hospital before he was transferred to the hospital in Rikers Island, where he would spend another 11 months. One of the challenges in addressing violence without prison is the belief that we do not have other options available to us. That is simply not true. There is no single answer nor a perfect one, but throughout the country, formally and informally, people are tackling violence in ways that reflect the core values of honoring those harmed and holding those responsible accountable with dignity. Many of these strategies are working. Many are imperfect, but we cannot measure their success against perfection, because what they stand to displace is, to put it mildly, far from perfect. They stand to displace Mass incarceration as a strategy to address violence is failing. Punishment as our core mode of responding to violence is failing. We as a nation are failing. When we admit to that failure, we become responsible for trying something different. We are not a people who are taking a medication that is working and considering an experimental new drug. We are people who are taking a medication that is barely scratching the surface of our symptoms and generating compounding side effects that are becoming increasingly unbearable. In this context, when we decide to try something different, we are not taking much of a risk. We are acknowledging that the risk associated with the status quo is not one that we continue to assume. So we choose something different, not out of innovation or bravery or curiosity, but out of responsibility to what remains of our democracy. Perhaps one of the greatest harms to the criminal justice system has done is persuaded us that we do not know how to solve the problems that arise between and among us. We have been taught that our experience is inconsequential loud. Let me start over. Perhaps one of the greatest harms of the criminal justice system has done is persuaded us we do not know how to solve the problems that arise between and among us. We have been taught that our experience is inconsequential in comparison to the evidence the experts present, and that the strategies we gravitate toward instinctively, calling each other's families first instead of the police, addressing the underlying causes of people's behavior, requiring people to give back to those they harmed, are somehow not only wrong, but socially irresponsible. But our experience is invaluable. Those of us who have been harmed, who have lost loved ones, who have caused others pain and repaired it as best we could, we know something. And that knowledge we possess is pragmatic. It is firmly grounded in reality, and it can become the basis for expanding approaches to violence that stand a chance at keeping us safe. Communities have long had the capacity to address the pain that arises within them. When we combine the inherent ability of human beings to participate in transforming harm with some of the centuries-old tools for doing so, we open pathways to safety and justice that are otherwise unavailable. Restorative justice is one such pathway. With its roots tracing back to a wide range of indigenous practices, much of the restorative justice as we implement it in the United States today has its origins in circles practiced by the Plains people in North America, the Maori in New Zealand, and as Dr. Morris Jenkins has taught us, a variety of African communities. The lineage and application of restorative justice practices raises complex questions about cultural appropriation that are beyond the scope of this book, but it is unquestionable that the approach's central lessons are deeply held across diverse cultures, passed down in a wide variety of ways, and at their best, nurtured and changed by the people and communities implementing them. These practices persist because they work. Substantial research in the United States, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom has demonstrated that restorative justice can be an effective response to violent crime, reducing recidivism rates by as much as 44% and helping to break the cycles of violence. Restorative justice will not fully replace incarceration. It is not a panacea. I can't say that word. But for an enormous number of cases in the criminal justice system, its existence does mean that we can no longer pretend we do not know what else to do. I know restorative justice best through the work I have been part of at Common Justice, where we operate an alternative to incarceration and victim services program for serious and violent felonies. Guided by restorative justice principles, we offer a survivor-centered accountability process that gives those directly impacted by acts of violence in the opportunity to shape what repair will look like, and in the case of the responsible party, to carry out that repair instead of going to prison. We work primarily with gunpoint robberies, serious assaults, shootings, and other acts of street violence committed by 16 to 26-year-olds. We do not work with cases of intimate partner or sexual violence, though we respect those who do. Common Justice's 15-month intervention for responsible parties includes an intensive violence intervention curriculum that runs concurrently to the restorative justice process. Participants who complete the program and fulfill all of their commitments to those they harmed are not incarcerated, and the felony charges against them are removed from their records. At the time of this writing, fewer than 6% of common justice participants had been terminated from the program for being convicted of a new crime. And in the 6 years from 2012, when the program underwent substantial refinement, to 2018, 6 years, the time of this writing, only one person had been terminated because of a new crime. At the same time, we provide wraparound services to a broad range of survivors of all demographics, nearly of all whom are members of groups typically excluded from most services and support for victims. A full 70% of our survivors, for instance, are men of color. Common Justice's experience is offered here not as the epitome of these processes, but as a source of examples that can reveal what this work can look like in practice, how it can align with the values that should guide our justice strategies, and what outcomes it can be expected to deliver. Our work at Common Justice is only one way of applying these principles. There are countless other interventions in communities, schools, and criminal justice settings across the country that look different in fundamental ways and show great promise. These include Project NIA and the Community Justice for Youth Institute of Chicago, and Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, RJOY, and Community Works in Oakland and San Francisco, the Community Conferencing Center in Baltimore, the Insight Prison Project in San Quentin, restorative justice projects growing throughout the country in partnership with Impact Justice, and many more. Common Justice's flaws and limitations should not be understood as the flaws and limitations of restorative justice, but rather as openings for others to do better. At its best, our efforts advance this work down the field and help us move closer, collectively, to being within striking distance of the goal. Restorative justice is a decision-making process that involves those most directly impacted by a given harm in identifying the pathway toward repair, and then carrying out the actions to get there. That sounds straightforward enough, but it is markedly different from the criminal justice system as we know it. The question of who should be involved in decision-making about repair is a fundamental one. If I am hurt, I am changed by it, and the people in my life are changed by it too. The crime may change how I can show up for them. It changes what I am available for and what I'm capable of, what I need from them. It changes their level of fear and safety sometimes as much as it changes my own. They carry the burden of my pain too, and it often touches their own pain. The criminal justice system defines very narrowly who has a stake in the outcome of a case. If you walk into a courtroom, you will see a defendant surrounded by a lot of other people who had nothing to do with what happened. You will almost never see the victim in that room. You almost never see the victims or the defendant's loved ones. You will just see someone who has caused harm in a room full of people who are disconnected from that harm and making a decision about what to do. Restorative justice inverts those exclusions, acting on the belief that transformation depends on the involvement of those who have the most on the line. In most restorative justice approaches, the central method of that involvement is a dialogue process often called a circle that includes the responsible party, the harmed party, and support people. In this process, people identify the harm that was done and begin to define a pathway to repair. These processes benefit from, and I would say require, thoughtful preparation. In robust preparation process leading up to the circle, participants have the opportunity to secure their basic safety and stability, gain an understanding of the restorative justice process and their options for taking part in it, identify the emotional and physical impact of their experience and begin to address those impacts, situate their experience in the context of their own history, family, and community, as well as those of the other party, develop the tools to communicate their experience, foster a readiness to engage with the other party in whatever way feels right, begin to think through possible agreements for what meaningful repair could look like, engage their community and support people in the process in whatever way makes sense, and make connection with therapeutic, medical, employment, educational, or other services to support their own healing and recovery. When everyone is prepared, the circle provides a framework and opportunity for accountability on the part of the responsible parties and healing on the part of those harmed. These processes are consonant with harmed people's most pressing needs: to ask why, to describe the harm they endured, to regain control and a sense of agency relative to the incident, to begin assembling a coherent narrative regarding what took place and thus plant the seeds of recovery from trauma, and to have that harm repaired in a way that is responsive and meaningful to them. At the same time, the process helps the responsible person to feel and take accountability, engage support from their existing networks, reach a dignified resolution with those harmed, develop a strong sense of responsibility, empathy, and capacity, and plan for and demonstrate follow-through. By providing not only an outlet for witnessing the human consequences of harm, but also an opportunity to regain a sense of dignity and self-worth, the process addresses key driving forces behind violence. In the circle, all parties decide on agreements other than incarceration to hold the responsible party accountable in ways meaningful to the person harmed. These may include responsible parties providing community service at places significant, learning about their own culture and the culture of the harmed parties, becoming positive role models to younger people in their lives and communities, addressing any harmful reliance on alcohol or other drugs, developing their skill sets as parents, or any number of other creative commitments particular to each case and the needs of the people affected by it. I could use some restorative justice in my family. Can't we all? Sorry. In shaping these agreements, some harmed parties want no further contact with the people who hurt them once the circle concludes. Others do. One man who participated in a circle at Common Justice had to walk daily past the place where the responsible party stabbed him. Every time he was overcome with fear, which subsided only into anger. As part of the circle, he asked the responsible party to meet him a handful of times at the place where the stabbing occurred, and to greet him respectfully and shake his hand. It seemed simple enough, but for the harmed party, this allowed him to overwrite the experience of trauma, which was situated for him in a specific place, with an experience of reconciliation, safety, and respect. Another harmed party wanted his children to meet the responsible party's children. He said, "I want you to look in the eyes of the small children whose father you almost took from them that night with your gun. And after today, I believe in the father that you can be to your baby girl, and I want to say that to her face." In another case, the harmed and responsible parties did a speaking tour in their neighborhood, talking to younger people about the impact of violence on their lives and the options other than retaliation and prison that could be available to them. Many harmed and responsible parties start correspondences of some sort, and many harmed parties find that witnessing the trajectory of the responsible party's growth can contribute to their own healing. For others, they prefer to leave the responsible party's transformation fully to the restorative justice program and to be given few, if any, updates. For these harmed parties, their trust in the program to engage that process allows them to be released from it in a way that can give them a space they need to heal their own pain and live their own lives. Just as not all harmed parties want ongoing contact with the people who hurt them, not all of them want to participate in a circle. And they never have to. They do not incur an obligation for being hurt. Harmed parties do not want to attend the circle can be represented by a surrogate, someone who will take their seat in the circle and stand for their perspective. The surrogate can be someone close to them or can be someone who has been through something similar. Harmed parties can talk at length with the surrogate or can say what they want, no part in revisiting the harm they survived. They can decide how they want their voices heard. They can simply entrust the surrogate to represent them. They can write a letter and have it read aloud. They can record a video or an audio statement. They can provide a list of questions. They can attend the first half of the circle but not the second, or vice versa. They can essentially do what works for them to participate in the shaping the repair they are owed. This emphasis on repair reflects restorative justice's primary concern with harm rather than with broken rules. Restorative justice contends that crime causes harm to people, relationships, and community, and this is different from thinking of crime primarily as a violation of the law. If the primary understanding of crime is about legal infraction, then the most urgent of concern is to reassert the power of the state through the enforcement of the law. But if the core concern is that people have been harmed, the priority is to repair that harm. Restorative justice requires a fundamental belief in the humanity of those who have been harmed and those who cause harm. People who have been harmed have to be regarded as worthy of care, even if they are imperfect, even if they've caused harm themselves, even if they owe repair to someone else for what they have done. It is not the harmed party's innocence that entitles them to repair. It is their humanity. Similarly, people who commit harm deserve and owe it to repair the harm they have caused. That seems obvious, but our criminal justice system not only fails to require repair, it often prohibits it. Other than financial restitution, which is notorious for how ineffective it is managed, the system creates obstacles to the ways responsible people could make right for what they have done. Prisons, for instance, typically disallow communication among victims and incarcerated people. Victims who seek dialogues with those who hurt them or killed their loved ones face enormous and often insurmountable legal and bureaucratic barriers. These barriers are rooted in the ways that the standard criminal justice process profoundly underestimates the degree to which the people who have committed harm can be contributors to healing. The system treats them as though their only capacity is to cause greater pain to those they have harmed, and as though its only job is to keep those people away from survivors, and depending on the scale of the harm, from the rest of us as well. What we know is the truth is messier. Some people unquestionably pose an ongoing risk, whether physical or emotional, to those they have harmed. Others can offer something meaningful to a survivor's healing process, whether that is information, recognition, or repair, and many people belong to both of those categories at once. Restorative justice also contends that it is not only the harmed and responsible parties that have a role in identifying and carrying out the repair, but the community as well. What that means is that a sense of urgency about solutions requires that we involve those whose lives are at stake in the problem. In restorative justice, that includes the people who raise the people in the circle, those who see them day in and day out, those who will reap the benefit or pay the price for whether or not they change. The approach is based on a belief that support people have a central role in the necessary transformation of the harm. Addressing what happened requires not removing the harm from their support people, but rather locating the harm more closely among them and giving them the room and the tools to address it. As described by Howard Zier, one of the early leaders in the modern restorative justice movement in the United States, the questions those people aim to address are: who has been hurt? What are their needs? Who has the obligation to address the needs, put right the harms, and restore relationships? Those questions are in stark contrast with the more standard criminal justice questions. What rules were broken, who did it, and who did they deserve as a result? What do they deserve as a result? As with any problem, the way we frame a question plants the seeds of how we will answer it. So restorative justice requires us to reopen a core question in our society. When harm has been done, who owes what to whom and why? It is a question whose current dominant answer is baked into the fiber of our criminal justice system as we know it, into our disciplinary practices in schools, and even into our neighborhoods. And when we ask it again, we get the option to answer differently. And that includes the option to reconceive of justice as getting well rather than getting even. As Fania Davis, the former executive director of restorative justice for Oakland Youth and a visionary in the restorative justice field, has written, "My dream is that restorative justice might help move us from an ethic of separation, domination, and extreme individualism to an ethic of collaboration, partnership, and interrelatedness. In that sense, I would say that this movement is more subversive than any of the revolutionary movements in which I have been involved since the 1950s. Restorative justice's transformative potential does not arise from its newness, but rather from the way in which it draws entirely from insight, power, and capabilities that already exist wherever harm occurs. It is because of its alignment with these capabilities that it stands to help solve the problems incarceration cannot. It is worthwhile in this context to revisit the 4-part test that any approach to violence should pass. It should be survivor-centered, accountability-based, safety-driven, and racially equitable. People who are hurt deserve a process that will help them heal. People who are responsible for harm deserve to be held accountable for that. All of us deserve responses to crime that make us safer. Those responses must be equitably available. The promise of restorative justice can be understood through each of these 4 principles. A survivor-centered approach. Elijah came home after being bailed out, trying to settle into his new life. His sense of self was reduced to the evidence of what he had survived. It consumed every other way he might see himself. He avoided mirrors, he disliked brushing his teeth or going to the dentist. He wouldn't let anyone take pictures of him, at least not from that side, and whenever people looked at him, he imagined that all they were seeing and all they were thinking about was his scar. As a young man of color, he knew that in job interviews, he was more likely to be perceived as someone who had engaged in street violence, not just someone who was hurt. He knew he might be asked about it and then would have to tell or avoid telling the story like he liked least in his life. He felt a range of seemingly conflicting emotions. At one moment, an acute, overwhelming sense of fear. At others, a sense of numbness and detachment. He lost his appetite, he couldn't sleep, and had nightmares when he did. He was furious. He was shivering. It would be more than a year until he would hear about the concept of trauma and assemble all those feelings into a single group. At the time, it was just chaos. Elijah, Danielle, and Elwyn's case was relatively atypical for common justice because of the overlapping roles each person played. Danielle was only a responsible party in the case, but Elijah was both harmed and responsible. Although Elwyn sliced his face, causing the scar, Elijah still bears to this day. Elijah was also part of the group responsible for assaulting Elwyn. Elwyn similarly was responsible for harming Elijah, but he was also stabbed in the lung and fought his way back from the death's door as a result. Fortunately, restorative justice is capable of acknowledging and holding people's multiple roles as at once harmed and responsible, at once owed and in debt. In their capacity as survivors during the preparatory process, and even more fully in the circle, Elijah and Elwyn each spoke about the pain they experienced and its lasting impact on their lives. It was in the circle that Elijah identified himself as a scar, where he shared the strategies he had developed to avoid mirrors, admitted to his new aversion to going to the dentist, to the way he had become more reluctant to leave his home or talk with people face to face. It was there that Elwyn shared how close he had felt to death, how terrified he was at the time, and how shaken he had remained since. Their pain was the center of gravity for the circle. It was the very thing the process was responsible for repairing. Restorative justice is not the only way to meet survivors' needs, nor can it provide survivors with everything they deserve. To begin with, survivors need services and support that have nothing to do with the person who hurt them, such as therapy, relocation resources, and services related to mental health and substance use. We need a social fabric that provides survivors with the wide range of supports that they deserve over their lifetime and exists independent of whatever is done with or for the person who caused harm. But we also need strategies to address that harm, and restorative justice stands out as one of the most promising ways to do so. When these processes are held with integrity and genuinely center the survivors throughout, they pay off. Restorative justice has been shown to leave those harmed more satisfied with outcomes. Survivors who have taken part in restorative processes in the United States have reported 80 to 90% rates of satisfaction as compared with satisfaction rates of about 30% for traditional court systems. More recently, restorative justice programs have also been shown to significantly reduce post-traumatic stress symptoms in survivors. A study by the University of Pennsylvania that examined restorative justice programs found that robbery, assault, and burglary victims who took part in them reported 37% fewer symptoms of post-traumatic stress than those who participated in standard court processes. Those impacts are in part attributable to the fact that these processes include precisely the things survivors want and don't get from the criminal justice process: answers, voice, control, repair, and a belief that others will be protected from the harm they survived. For many survivors, the circle is a particularly powerful contributor to their healing, in part because it can help transform power. No one is at the head of the table in a circle. No one is at the top. While the harmed party's voice is central, its centrality in no way diminishes the value or importance of the responsible party's voice, or the voices of support people who are present. Responsible parties are asked to answer for what they have done from a position that affirms and reorients their personal power, rather than one that aims to constrict it. And harmed parties are brought into an equitable power dynamic with the person whom they did not have the power to stop from hurting them. For some harmed parties, the circle itself can provide substantial relief from the pain, rage, confusion, loss, and fear that so many survivors feel after they have been hurt, and it can form the basis for the ongoing healing work they undertake formally and informally. For others, the benefits of that transformation comes later. As the agreements are completed, both those and the responsible parties complete their own and those that involve their survivors in some way. So that was the section. That was a long. 4 principles. That was the first of 4 principles. All right, the second of the 4 is accountability. Let's read about that. Danielle's, Elwyn's, and Elijah's agreements emerging from their circle was similar, with adjustments that reflected each of their respective levels of responsibility and each of their goals and areas of growth. Danielle's commitments, for example, required the following. He had to keep a weekly journal, take the GED exam, complete a medical assistant certificate training program, complete his resume, and seek employment. He had to conduct community service, share reflections about his experience with a group of his peers, and plan one activity every month to take part in with his children. He had to get all of his necessary documentation, identification, and paperwork in order, dress professionally for court, and when he had completed his public speaking engagement, and go to the doctor and receive a full physical exam to gain an understanding of the current status of his physical well-being. Danielle had to read and watch a combination of 10 books, sets of articles, and films that gave him insight into himself, his community, and his history, and share his reflections on what he read and watched. Write reflections about his experience with the police and at the hospital when he needed medical attention. Write a letter to himself that he read when he was losing focus to help him regain his momentum and commitment. Write a letter of apology to Elwyn and his family, expressing his responsibility and remorse for the harm caused, and his reflections about how the circle affected him. Write a letter to his children telling the story of what happened. Write an anti-violence pledge. Share it with the other responsible parties at a community meeting and invite them to take the pledge too. Write a journal entry with images that represent how he saw himself and his community, and learn about what is required to publish a book and investigate options for self-publishing and recommendations to new writers. He had to spend time listening to other harmed parties to learn about their experience and share his own as appropriate. Write an essay about the impact of violence on individuals, families, and communities, and about how young men of color behave when they are afraid. Participate in a group session quarterly with his brother and the harmed party so that they could get to know each other as men and mend the harm among them. Attend at least 3 counseling sessions so that he could talk about and heal through the pain and trauma of what happened. Meditate 6 times for at least 15 minutes each time, and help create a memorial or message to be placed at the bus stop where the incident occurred. Finally, He had to attend the MOVE, Men Opposing Violence Everywhere, groups at Common Justice, which focus on the development of healthy masculinity. Boy, we sure need that here in Rockford. More than 6 years later, at the time of this writing, Danielle is now on staff at Common Justice as an intervention manager. Among his responsibilities is the facilitation of the MOVE groups. At a recent event, Danielle reflected on his experience as a participant in Common Justice. I got into Common Justice because I committed a violent act. When I went to Rikers Island, automatically I'm thinking of all the horror stories about the place. I'm doing push-ups in my cell. I'm not taking food from people. I'm doing all this stuff just thinking to myself, I'm going to have to go through this thing that I heard so many other black men like me were being inducted into. Then, instead, I get to Common Justice and meet the person that I harmed. Now, it's not just about me. It's like I had to go through something to feel a connection to anybody being hurt. I had to go through my own hurt too. I had to deal with that part of myself because, like they say, hurt people hurt people. You don't have to tell me I did good by going in a store and doing something I thought was protecting my brother. It wasn't. But I want you to acknowledge the pain that was in it for me too. When you do, you watch the magic of something happen where you start to give the same care back to the person that you have harmed. That's what meeting that person has done. We've been different places sharing our story. I'm sitting here looking at this person like, you're so similar to me. You're so much of who I am. Your dreams are like mine. Your mother's dreams for you are like my mother's dreams are for me. We are so connected and we didn't even know this thing. If I knew that before, I wouldn't have moved the way I moved. I wasn't connected. I don't know when we lose our connection. I can't tell you that, but I was disconnected from something that was already here for us, way before this. The one thing that I can say in this process is yours. It was already here. This is your thing. This is of your culture. That made me feel powerful. I also felt mad because something was held back from me, but I felt powerful that I knew it now. When asked to define accountability, Danielle said, "It was answering to the people of the community that surrounded the person I harmed. It was answering to the community of people that surrounded me. It was basically being able to answer to all points, and you can't do that when you're locked up. You can't speak to all points. You can't answer for that. You don't get a chance to do so." The day before the circle, when asked, another responsible party described what he had hoped to get out of it. The way I think about it, I owe him twice. Once for what I did, and once for giving me this chance. And both those debts will take my lifetime to repay. The grace of restorative justice is that there is dignity in paying those debts, and the lifetime it takes to pay them stands to be longer and more fulfilling as a result. After the circle, we asked that young man what struck him most. He said that he would never forget the way the harmed party reached out his hand, not to punch me, not to shoot me, not to give me the finger. He reached out to shake my hand like a man. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. It has been more than 6 years since Elijah, Elwyn, and Danielle sat together at the circle. Danielle works at Common Justice, and the other two young men are also employed, safe, and thriving. It's hard to imagine what their lives would have been like otherwise. They would each have come home from prison in 2017 after serving 5 years upstate, a setting that would have presented no opportunity to heal through their trauma. They would be saddled with violent felony convictions and would almost assuredly still blame one another for their pain. Danielle does not believe they would all be alive today if they had been incarcerated. It seems certain they would not all be doing so well and so useful to others, so present in their children's lives, so valuable in their communities, so oriented toward the future, so capable of repair, so capable, dare I say it, and risk being accused of being soft on crime, yes, of love. And the third article, of 4 is safety. The most legitimate function of prisons in our society is to hold people we cannot safely hold in our communities. The challenge that arises for those who want to see the end of mass incarceration, then, is to develop more and better community capacity to address harm so that we can break our reliance on prison without compromising our obligation to secure safety. While restorative justice achieves this in part by reducing recidivism, it is crucial to also conceive of safety as something broader than just reduced recidivism. Safety includes the cessation of violence, of course, but it also includes the presence of healing. It is based on connection, and it thrives not on the suppression of power, but on the rightful exercise of it. One night, a young man robbed an immigrant named Federico of his week's wages as he came home from a 15-hour shift at the restaurant where he worked in a kitchen for cash. The incident changed everything for Federico, who experienced post-traumatic stress symptoms in its aftermath. He had trouble sleeping, withdrew from his relationship, and could not concentrate on studying for the GED test he had planned to take. He started taking taxis home, which consumed a huge portion of his already small income. He became afraid of walking on the street. He would say that whenever anyone came up behind him, even a little old lady, his mind would race, his heart would race, his stomach would turn, and his whole body would freeze up. Several months after Federico's case came to the common justice, we convened in a circle with Carl, the young man who robbed him. After hours of talking about what happened and its impact on Federico, we brainstormed ways that Carl could make things as right as possible. After the group suggested, and Carl agreed to, some typical actions, going to school, apologizing, doing community service, Carl added, "Every man older than me in my family has been to prison. My older brother served a long time, and he won the prison boxing league championship when he did. He is the one who taught me how to fight. I showed you the wrong end of that on the street that day, but he is also the one who taught me how to defend myself. And if you want, I will show you that too." Then it was Federico's turn to speak, and he said, "I would love that. Dude, somebody teach me how to fight. I need to know. I need to know how to fight. I don't like to fight. I don't want to fight, but I should probably know how." A few months after the circle, Federico and Carl went to a local dojo, supervised by a seasonal martial artist. Carl first stood in the position of the person being held against his will, and Federico held him there. Carl demonstrated multiple ways to escape the hold. Then they switched positions. Federico was in the same position he was in the night he was mugged, and being held by the same man. Only this time, as he practiced the techniques Carl taught him with increasing skill, he was repeatedly able to free himself from Carl's grasp. The next day, Federico called me and said, "I'm calling to tell you nothing happened." "What?" I asked. Federico explained. "Nothing happened. A 6-foot-tall man passed me on the street, and nothing happened. His mind didn't race, his heart did not race, his stomach did not churn, his body did not freeze. Federico had a little while before he had to be at work, and he went to Times Square so he could walk by as many people as possible. He looked for the tallest people, the biggest men, to walk past. At each one he said to me on the phone, 'Nothing, nothing.' That is not an outcome that a standard criminal justice process, particularly one constrained by our dependence on mass incarceration, could have produced for him. Carl and Federico's experience stands as a stunning refutation of the myth that survivors' safety always depends on separation from the people who harm them. Not everyone could do what Carl did, or, for that matter, what Federico did. But for survivors whose healing could be aided by a restorative justice solution, we would be hard-pressed to come up with a legitimate ethical justification for denying them that path." And the fourth part of this is racial equity. How y'all doing?
Oh, damn, I'm sorry. Ready?
Just saying hi. Taking a breath.
How's it going?
I should probably take a drink of my...
I have to remind myself. How's it going?
Good.
At like 5:30, 5:35, we're gonna do a group conversation. You wanna be part of it?
I probably have to go home to my dog.
Okay, that's fine.
I would love to,
No, that's fine.
but I know
just
she's
wanted
going to
offer
be
it.
crossing her legs at home, wondering where I am.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Anytime. Open chair. Go ahead.
All right, racial equity. Years ago, in a park in East New York, Sean shot at Daquan. They had been friends until a recent disagreement that had torn them apart. Sean would later describe going to the park with the intention of just scaring Daquan, but as he arrived, he went in and out of consciousness, and the next thing he knew, he had shot the gun. Daquan saw the gun pointed at him, heard the shot, and not knowing whether he had been hit or not, ran for his life. Sean's shot thankfully missed, but the bullet hit a bystander on the foot. Sean ran out of the park in the opposite direction from Daquan. Daquan's 8-year-old sister, who saw it all happen, froze, shaking like a leaf. Eventually, a neighbor walked her home. When Daquan's mom heard the news, she ran to the park. My son wasn't there, she would later say, trembling at the thought of the memory, and no one could tell me where he was. I have never felt more afraid in my life. The time between then and when she finally heard her son's voice felt like an eternity. It would take Daquan some time to decide to tell the police. He did not believe they could keep him safe, and his fear that they would treat him as a suspect rather than a victim was sadly confirmed when he ultimately reported the crime. Feeling no promise of real protection, Daquan moved on a moment's notice to live with his older sister in Philadelphia, changing his sister's life as well. And because until then, Daquan had been his younger sister's primary child care provider while his mother was at work, this move upended the entire family. The loss was always imbued with the threat that it could have been. His mother said, "I almost lost my child. Every day I say to myself, he's still here. He's still here." Sean was arrested and charged with the shooting, and months later, the case came to common justice. It was only then that Sean told his mentors, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, about what had happened. Sean had been friends with their son Kenny and the year before, and he had been beside Kenny when he was fatally shot. Sean became close with the Millers in the aftermath of Kenny's death, which affected him deeply. "I was next to Kenny when he was killed, not even 2 inches away," he said. "After that, I would see it replay in my head every day, over and over, just like it just kept happening. I would cry at home, by myself, but could never cry when I was with other people. Nothing made it stop. Sometimes at school, it got too quiet, and I'd just start playing in my mind again. And it got to the point where I couldn't stand being in class because it was too quiet." Though he didn't make the connection when he first came to common justice, Sean would later draw a link between his own trauma and his decision to shoot Daquan, including identifying the dissociation he felt in the park that day with what he experienced whenever he remembered Kenny's death. Making the connection haunted him. As he would later put it to Daquan directly in the circle process, common justice convened. After being through that, after losing Kenny and everything, I felt safer. Sorry, that's not right. After being through that, after losing Kenny and everything I felt after, if I almost did the same thing to you, Daquan, and your family, then I must be the biggest fool in the world. It was the Millers who would help Sean figure out how to hold all these truths at once. They become involved in the circle process, where Mrs. Miller turned to Daquan's mother and said, "That feeling you felt before you found your son, I feel that every day, and it never stops. I'm here today because I believe this is a way to help Sean, because I hope it will help you, Daquan, and you, his mother, but also because it's part of my healing and all of our healing to stop these young boys killing each other, and I think what we're doing here can help do that." What they were doing in that circle was in part facing each other and the pain between them. But they were also crafting a response to the harm in the form of commitments Sean would have to fulfill. These commitments reflected the group's shared vision of the kind of man Sean could become and involved college, work, restitution, trauma-focused therapy, apologies, peace offerings, public speaking, and more. They required him to complete a significant number of hours of community service divided among the Millers' church, DeQuan's family's church, and a variety of projects happening in honor of Kenny. These projects all held him closer to the community he had damaged through his actions rather than casting him away. Over the nearly 2 years following, Sean worked through the program diligently, responsibly, and with consistent and unfaltering respect and focus. He is the young man referenced earlier who said, "The judge is in here now." He is now employed as a welder and is obtaining further training to advance his career and secure membership in a union. He has not been arrested for any new crimes, has become a role model to his peers and to younger people around him, and has taken on a leadership role in the Millers' nonprofit community and anti-violence efforts. DeQuan has completed college and his symptoms of trauma have subsided. His family has found peace too. No one involved in this situation believes the court and prison could have produced such an outcome. It was the people whose lives that were at stake who could do so. As Mr. Miller put it when Sean graduated, "We did it." DeQuan and Sean, Elijah, Elwyn, and Danielle, Carl, and Federico, all of these young men are young men of color. Their loved ones who participated in the process are people of color. That sounds simple enough, but it is rare that solutions to violence are led by people whose lives are at stake because of it. One way that racial inequality and equity manifests is in shaping who gets to decide what happens in response to harm. These men and their support people together centered the experience of those among them who had been harmed, defined and practiced accountability, and carved a new pathway to safety. They accessed an exit ramp from the courts and the road to mass incarceration, and instead built a thing that they were always capable of from the start: a reconciliation that honored the past and made possible the future of each of them deserves. Mass incarceration's disproportionate impact on communities of color is even more reprehensible when we are honest about how capable the members of communities are at solving their own problems when they have the space to do so. Or money. People who commit harm have in themselves what they need to transform. Common Justice sees this daily, in part because our curriculum is entirely inquiry-based. Our staff does not tell people what is true. We do not believe people are vessels into whom we are pouring empathy and good values. Rather, we believe people are fundamentally capable of insight and transformation, and regard it as our job to help dismantle the barriers to those things being fully present and expressed. People who commit harm know more about why people commit harm than do the rest of us. Responsible parties are almost all survivors of violence, so they all know too well about the lasting impact of actions like the ones they took. Young people of color know concretely about the daily impacts of structural racism and have the information they need to arrange their experience into a structural analysis. It is only when embedded in such a structural context that real lasting change is possible. There we go. What time is it? Oh. You said at 5:30 they were going to do that discussion, right? Where should I... Because I just finished the fourth part of that.
Yeah.
Should I stop? Like...
If you wanna...
I think I just need to read a couple more spots here. Oh.
Yeah, if you wanna...
I just have like 2 more pages. 2.5. All right, cool.
If you want to.
Just my arm. right, I'm just going to read 2.5 more pages, and we'll be wrapping it up for the discussion, which I won't be able to attend. At its best, restorative justice challenges and allows us to hold seemingly contradictory truths at the same time. On one hand, we recognize the reality of this country's inequitable conditions and how and why they have arisen, and on the other hand, we recognize the reality of individual agency. Restorative justice allows us to acknowledge that the context in which harm takes place is almost never right or fair. And still, even within that context, each one of us is responsible for carving out the most ethical, most righteous lives we can. It honors each person's dynamism. That's a weird word. It honors each person's dynamism and self-determination while never pretending we exist independent of our context or our often unjust constraints. We are a long way from these kinds of solutions being universally available. But fortunately, we do have an example of what non-prison-based solutions to crime look like at a systemic level. It is what we do for white kids, and for middle class and rich white kids in particular. We could reasonably describe whiteness as the oldest alternative to incarceration in America. We begin diverting privileged white children at an early age. Most of the time, though certainly not all, we hold them close, keeping them after school rather than throwing them away, sending them to jail. We ask them what is wrong. We believe that what they have done by the time they are 12 is not indicative of everything they can and will do with the rest of their lives. We treat them like children and young people they are. We typically worry about them rather than fear them when they act up. We provide pathways out of the chaos. It's spitting. We treat them like the children and young people they are. We typically worry about them rather than fear them, and when they act up, we provide pathways out of the chaos and idiocy of adolescence and into adulthood. White people who are being honest will admit how badly we needed exactly that, and how we deserved it. The problem is, so did the kids of color who didn't get the same opportunities. I would like to say that the restorative justice movement has been immune to this kind of racial bias. But like most broad movements in this country, it has not been. At least not in the parts of the movement led primarily by white people. Believing in the potential of restorative justice for addressing violence requires believing unequivocally in the humanity of all the people involved, including the responsible parties. Racism diminishes white people's ability to believe unequivocally in the humanity of people of color. This means that until white people grapple with the ways we have internalized racism and anti-blackness in particular, we will not fight for the expansion of these practices as we are morally obligated to, and instead will create knowingly or unknowingly barriers to their advancement. We are moving in the right direction. The restorative justice movement is growing in the United States under the leadership of people of color and their anti-racist white accomplices in a way that is becoming more aligned and intertwined with the struggle for racial justice. The movement is using its tools of repair to grapple with its own omissions, dishonesty, and disregard. Increasingly, people are carving a way forward that reflects the fundamental values of humanity and answerability that lie at the heart of restorative justice. In my view, one of the most profound effects of this shift, and there are many, is that unlike before, many people in our movement now consider ourselves part of the struggle to end mass incarceration. It may seem strange that these movements have not been previously aligned or interconnected on a large scale, but they have not. This is partly because the movement to end mass incarceration has been largely focused, with essential, notable exceptions, on critiquing and shrinking the reach of jails and prison, not on displacing them. That movement's focus on the drug war has also drawn its attention away from cases of harm between and among people, which is where restorative justice does its work. On the other hand, the broader restorative justice movement also, with essential notable exceptions, has largely shied away from tackling violence, has often taken a we are all human approach to equity rather than steering into the realities of historic and present oppressions, and has criticized the movement to end mass incarceration as too combative, or perhaps more often, people have not thought about it at all. That division is ending. The increased focus on racial equity in the restorative justice movement has brought the carnage of mass incarceration squarely into the center of our attention, and the movement to end mass incarceration's increasing recognition that it will need to expand its focus beyond low-level and drug-related crimes and include interpersonal harm in its scope created a sense of urgency about identifying alternate ways to address crime and violence. The potential of this emerging alignment is enormous. When the struggle to end what we can no longer withstand meets with the struggle to advance what we can do instead, we might just stand a chance of winning. Good. Do you have a bookmark? Oh, we'll just do this.
Wrapping up the live, we're gonna. I don't know if you can hear me or not.
So we're going to wrap up this live, and then there's going to be a discussion after this, right?
Yep.
All right.
About 5-10 minutes. 10 minutes. We'll be back.